In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get input from a user. So we're basically going to allow a user to input information into our program. And I'm actually going to take the information that the user inputs, I'm going to store it inside of a variable, and then we're going to be able to do something with that variable. So I want to show you guys how we can actually go about getting input from someone. And down here in my Python file, all I have to do to get input from someone is I just have to type out input and then an open and closed parentheses. And what this is basically going to do is it's going to tell Python, like, hey, we want to get input from a user, and Python will allow the user to type in some information. And inside of these parentheses, we can actually type a prompt. And so generally when we want the user to enter in some information, we want to tell them what we want them to enter. And that's what we can put inside of here. So I'm just going to say, enter your name. So we're actually going to create a little Python app which is going to allow the user to enter in their name, and then we'll store the name inside of a variable, and then we'll basically just say hi to the user. So we'll say like hi, and then whatever the name they entered was. So what I want to do is I actually want to store whatever the user inputted into our program inside of a variable. So I can actually go over here and I can create a variable. I could just call it name, and I could set this variable equal to input. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the value that the user inputs and I'm storing it inside of this variable container called name. And so now I have access to whatever they entered in. So what we can do is we can say print, and inside of the parentheses I can just print out hello, and then I'm just going to add on to this name. And actually, why don't we put an exclamation point? And so essentially we're getting a name from the user, we're storing it inside of the name variable, and I'm printing it out onto the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, and when we run the program, you'll notice down here Python is giving us this little prompt. So it's saying enter your name. And now in here I can actually type in a value. So I could type in Mike, and then I can just hit enter, and Python's going to go ahead, store this value inside of that variable, and then it's going to print out hello Mike. And so this is kind of cool, and actually what we could do is we could prompt the user to enter in more than one piece of information. So I could actually copy this line of code, and I'm going to paste it below here, and why don't we have the user enter in another variable. So we could have them enter in, for example, their age. And over here we just want to say enter your age. And so now we're able to get two pieces of information from the user, and I could say hello name, and then I can say you are, and I'll print out their age. So I'm just going to print age. So now I'm basically able to get both of these pieces of information from the user. I can get their name and I can get their age. So when we run this program, I can type in both of those pieces of information. So it'll say enter your name. So we could just make up a name like John, and then enter the age. Let's say John is 25. And now it's going to say, hello John, you are 25. So the program is able to get input from the user, and then it's able to use that information in order to say hi to the user and tell them how old they are. And so getting input from the user is a great way to make your programs more interactive. And here we're just scratching the surface, right? We're just basically getting two, pieces of information from the user, but you can use these inputs to do awesome things in Python. And as we go through this course, you're going to see some really cool things that we can do with these inputs. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a very basic calculator in Python. We're basically going to build a calculator where we'll get two numbers from a user, and then we'll add those numbers together and print the answer out onto the screen. So this will give us some practice in getting input from users, and we'll also talk about getting numbers from users as opposed to just strings. So I'm really excited to get started on this calculator. The first thing we want to do is create two variables, and inside of those variables we want to store the two numbers that the user wants to add together. So down here I'm just going to say num1, and that's what we'll call our first variable, is equal to, and now I need to get input from the user. So I'm going to say input, And inside these parentheses, I'm going to say enter a number. And now I basically want to do the same exact thing, but for the second number. So we'll paste this guy down here, and I'm just going to say num2, and then we'll just say enter another number. So now we're able to store the user's input inside of these two variables. So now all I want to do is just print out the result. So I'm actually going to create a variable called result. So I'm just going to say result is equal to, and basically we just want to add these two numbers together. So I'm going to say num1 plus num2. And now all we have to do is just print out the result. So I'm just going to print result. So we basically have our entire program written out here, and this will allow us to enter in two numbers, and then we'll add them together and print out the answer. So I'm going to click play, and down here we can enter our number. So I'm going to enter the first number, we'll say 5, and I'm going to enter my second number. So let's say 8.0, or let's say 8.3. So now it should print out the answer, but if you look over here, that's not quite the answer we were looking for, right? 5 plus 8.3 is definitely not 58.3. And here's what happened. When we get input from a user, by default, Python is just going to convert it into a string. So it doesn't matter what we put down there when we're entering the numbers. Python's always just going to be like, okay, this is a string, that's it. Sounds good, right? It's just going to make it a string. In order for us to make these num1 and num2 variables numbers, we're actually going to have to convert the strings that we get from the user into numbers. And so the way that we can do that is by basically just coming over here, and when we add the two numbers together, I can use a special Python function in order to convert those strings into numbers. And there's actually two Python functions that we could use for this. The first is called int. So I could say int, I can make an open parentheses, and I can make a close parentheses. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to convert whatever is inside of these open and closed parentheses into an integer number. And an integer number is basically a whole number. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a whole number. In other words, it can't have a decimal point. And so what I could do is I could say int, and I could put these inside of parentheses. And now what this is going to do is it's going to convert both of these numbers into integers, in other words, into whole numbers that don't have decimals, and it's going to add them together and we'll print out the result. So why don't we do that, and we'll just see if this works. So I'm going to click the play button, and down here we'll enter our first number. So I'm just going to enter in a 4, and then I'll enter in a 5. And now you can see it's printing out the correct answer, 4 plus 5. And so that's essentially our basic calculator. But we do have one problem with this calculator. So I'm going to run it again, and I'll show you guys what that problem is. If I wanted to add in a decimal number, so we'll add 4.3 and 5.5, you'll see that we're getting this error. And that's because I'm using this int function up here, and this int function is looking for a whole number. So if I put decimal numbers inside of there, it's going to break the program. There's another function we can use. Instead of an int, we can say float, and a float is basically just a number that has decimals, so it's a decimal number. And so I can convert both of these guys into floats, and now I'll be able to use decimal numbers. So I can click play, and I can just enter in some numbers. So I could say like 4, and I could also say like 5.5. And now it's going to be able to add both of those numbers, even if one of them is a decimal. And that's the beauty of using that little float function. So in certain circumstances, you might want the user to only be able to enter in an integer, so a whole number. But in a lot of cases, like in this calculator, we want them to be able to enter any number that they want. So we're going to use this float function. So I'm just going to recap what we did one more time. We created two variables, num1 and num2, and we basically stored the two numbers that the users inputted into those variables. And then we converted them into numbers, and we added them together, and we printed out the results. So this is a pretty cool calculator. I'm happy with it. Hopefully you guys learned something. And as we go forward in this Python course, you're going to learn all sorts of ways that we can make this calculator more complex.